This is the story of a weapon that killed nearly 5,000 American sailors, and the fact that 80 years later nobody can agree on how many ships it actually sank. The most widely repeated figure is 34, and that number turns up in encyclopedias, in United States Air Force publications, and in almost every documentary ever made on this subject. What almost nobody mentions is where it came from, which was a book published in 1958 by two Imperial Japanese Navy officers who had run the program themselves. A book whose own ship list contains only 32 names. Other serious researchers put the total at 47. Others at 57. Robin really puts it near 60. None of that qualifies as a rounding error, because those are gaps approaching 100% on the most basic question anyone could ask about the Special Attack Corps. The Japanese called it TACO, meaning Special Attack. The Imperial Japanese Navy's first formal unit carried the name Shinpu Tokubetsu Kagekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Unit, named after the typhoons that wrecked Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281. Westerners read those same characters as Kamikaze, and the mistranslation stuck so completely that it became the word the entire world now uses. Between October of 1944 and August of 1945, somewhere near 4,000 Japanese airmen deliberately flew aircraft into Allied warships. This video is not asking whether that was monstrous. The question here runs narrower, colder, and considerably harder to answer, which is whether the thing actually worked. Underneath that sits a second question that turns out to matter more, because on both sides of this war, the people counting the results had powerful institutional reasons to get the count wrong. By October of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had run out of the one thing that makes carrier aviation function, and it was not aircraft. Pilots were the shortage. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro arrived in the Philippines to command the First Air Fleet and inherited an air arm that could no longer hit what it aimed at. In the early morning hours of October 20th, 1944, Onishi assembled the 1st Special Attack Squadron at Mabalacat Airfield, and the unit took the name Shikishima. The reasoning attributed to Vice Admiral Onishi carried nothing mystical in it. Arithmetic drove the decision. A pilot who could no longer reliably place a bomb on a moving carrier deck could still reliably place an aircraft on one, provided he never intended to pull out. On October 21st, 1944, the heavy cruiser HMS Australia took a hit that killed Captain Emile de Caniaux, and that strike sometimes gets described as the first kamikaze hit of the war. The claim is contested, and it belongs in the record as contested rather than settled. The first unambiguous organized success arrived 4 days later. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, on October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Seiki Yukio led the Shikishima unit against the American escort carrier force. Seiki's aircraft struck the escort carrier USS St. Lo at 10:51 in the morning, and she went down roughly 30 minutes afterward. Out of a crew of 889, 113 were killed or listed missing, and about 30 more later died of their wounds. The escort carrier USS Santee took damage the same day. St. Lo became the first major warship in history sunk as the result of a kamikaze attack. One structural fact gets skipped in nearly every account, and it matters enormously for the numbers, which is that there was never one kamikaze program. There were two. The Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army ran separate special attack efforts with separate chains of command, separate aircraft, separate doctrine, and separate expectations of success. Navy planners assumed roughly 1 sortie in 6 would hit, while Army staff assumed 1 in 3. That amounts to a 100% divergence in the core planning assumption between two services fighting the same war on the same islands against the same fleet. 2 programs, 2 sets of books, and that is where the counting problem begins. The aircraft themselves were, by design, the worst available. Older and less airworthy airframes went routinely to TACO units on the entirely rational logic that a machine, which would not survive a return flight, had no need to. Late in the war, Japan built the Nakajima Ki 115 Tsurugi specifically for the role, constructed partly of wood and powered by engines already sitting in storage. The pilots followed the same curve, because the men of the first Philippine units were experienced naval aviators, while the men flying off Kyushu 6 months later were, in large numbers, minimally trained student conscripts. Here is the case that the Special Attack Corps worked, and it lands harder than most people expect. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the post-war Allied effort to measure what the air war had accomplished, counted approximately 2,550 kamikaze sorties across all Japanese services, excluding escort aircraft. Of those, 475 were assessed as effective, meaning they scored hits or damaging near misses. 18.6%. That number means nothing without a baseline, and the baseline carries the entire argument. Modern engineering and finance both carry a standing warning about measuring a system against its own degraded state rather than against an absolute standard. A factory that climbs from catastrophic to merely bad has improved, technically, and the improvement is real, and it tells you nothing whatsoever about whether the factory should keep operating. Everything in the kamikaze efficiency debate lives inside that distinction. By the time Vice Admiral Onishi formed the Shikishima unit, conventional Japanese air attack had effectively stopped functioning. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea and again at the Formosa Air Battle, fewer than 1% of attacking Japanese aircraft inflicted damage on an American ship. Not a 1% hit rate on bombs released. Less than 1% of aircraft dispatched achieved anything at all. Measured against that, 18.6% stops being an improvement and becomes a different category of weapon. The 18.6 is no outlier either, because multiple independent analyses converge in the same band, with a clear downward trend as the war ran on. The Allied Air Operations Research Group measured hits against sorties in the Philippines campaign at 17.7%, 115 hits from 650 sorties, with a later phase falling to around 9.5%. Bill Gordon, working through the primary records ship by ship, puts the Philippines figure near 27% for hits or damaging near misses, and the Okinawa figure near 13%. A commonly cited Japanese-derived figure of roughly 11%, 1 in 9, sits in the same range for the later period. Max Hastings summarizes the whole thing as approximately 20% of kamikaze assaults scoring hits, which he describes as almost 10 times the success rate of conventional attack. Different methodologies, different definitions of a hit, different campaign windows, different national archives. Every one of them lands somewhere between 9 and 27%, against a conventional baseline under 1%. Hastings offers the cleanest single comparison in the entire dataset. During the Okinawa campaign, from the 6th of April to the 22nd of June, 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 27 ships and damaged 164. Over the same weeks, against the same fleet, in the same water, conventional Japanese bombers sank 1 ship and damaged 63. 27 to 1. The cumulative damage figures carry the same weight, and the composite most often cited from United States service publications runs. 34 ships sunk, 368 damaged, for 1,907 killed, for 1,824 wounded. For 1,907 American Navy dead at Okinawa deserves to be sat with, because it stands as the heaviest naval loss of the Pacific War. The United States Navy suffered worse casualties in that one campaign than in any other battle it fought. Stevens-Aloga, counting more broadly across the Kikusui operations and their associated sorties, puts the toll above 7,000 sailors killed, with 11 destroyers sunk, 6 other vessels sunk, and 279 damaged. The damage totals scale with the source as well. One reconciliation lands near 288 damaged, including 16 fleet carriers, 3 light carriers, and 17 escort carriers. The United States Air Force composite gives 368. Robin Reilly's accounting climbs above 400. At Okinawa, among 145 ships sunk or put out of action for 30 days or longer, 133 were lost to air attack. The case that it worked comes down to this. A broken Air Force, flying its worst aircraft with its least experienced pilots, achieved a per sortie damage rate roughly an order of magnitude better than it had managed with trained crews and functioning doctrine, and it inflicted the worst naval casualties of the Pacific War doing it. Hold on to that, because every figure just cited carries a problem, and the problem is not accuracy. Both sides had reasons to lie about it. Before the first organized kamikaze attack was ever flown, the Japanese reporting system had already produced the largest single falsehood of the Pacific War, and it did so entirely by accident. From the 12th to the 16th of October, 1944, American carrier aircraft struck Japanese airfields on Formosa. Japan committed its land-based air strength and lost more than 300 aircraft, while the Americans lost fewer than 100. The cruiser USS Canberra took a torpedo on the 13th. The cruiser USS Houston took one on the 14th. Both were damaged, and neither sank. Two damaged American cruisers made up the entire result. On the 16th of October, 1944, Imperial General Headquarters announced to the Japanese public that its forces had sunk 11 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 1 destroyer or light cruiser, while admitting the loss of 312 Japanese aircraft. 11 carriers. The actual figure was 0. Nobody decided to deceive anyone. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru commanded the land-based air forces involved, and his crews were flying at night, in poor conditions, largely inexperienced, and they reported what they believed they had seen. Burning ships, explosions on the water, aircraft that never returned, which in the reporting logic of that moment meant aircraft that had struck something. Each individual report was plausible, the aggregation was fantasy, and no mechanism existed anywhere in the chain to catch the difference. Modern organizational research has a name for what happened over Formosa, which is a feedback loop with no corrective signal. Aviation safety works because the black box survives the crash and contradicts the pilot. Medical trials work because failures get counted alongside successes. Financial forecasting stays tethered to reality only when the forecast gets checked against the outcome, and the person who made it has to sit with the gap. Strip out the correction, and a system does not drift at random. Drift follows the incentives, which point upward, always, and it accelerates, because every uncorrected overestimate becomes the baseline for the next one. The Special Attack Corps was about to institutionalize exactly that failure. A conventional pilot claiming a carrier might be contradicted by reconnaissance, by another pilot, or by his own next mission. A taco pilot could be contradicted by nobody, because the only witness to the attack was the man who never came back. Verification passed permanently to escort and observer aircraft, watching from distance, through smoke, under fire, with every reason on earth to believe the man they had just escorted to his death had not died for nothing. The Formosa claims did not stay in the newspapers, because they traveled up the chain and straight into operational planning. Imperial General Headquarters altered the Shogo plan on the strength of a naval victory that had never occurred, and between the 17th and 20th of October, 1944, Japan began committing its remaining surface fleet toward Leyte Gulf, into waters it believed had just been cleared of 11 American carriers. Admiral Toyota Somu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, sat for interrogation after the war with the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, and that transcript survives. Asked about the decision, Toyota described taking the fleet into Leyte as an enormous gamble, and said that it was decided to take that gamble and to send the whole fleet. Here is the detail that makes the episode genuinely tragic rather than merely stupid, because the record indicates that Admiral Toyota believed the Formosa claims were exaggerated, and he appears to have felt obligated to launch Shogo regardless. The commander of the combined fleet suspected the numbers were false and committed the fleet anyway, because the institution had already announced them. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is the specific failure that occurs when an organization's public claims turn load-bearing, and correcting them costs more than acting on them. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ran from the 23rd to the 26th of October, 1944, and it destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. The first organized kamikaze attack was flown on the 25th, in the middle of it. The Philippines served as the prototype, and Okinawa became the program at full scale, which is where every meaningful number in this story was generated. Vice Admiral Agaki Matome commanded the 5th Air Fleet out of Kyushu, and Agaki kept a diary throughout, published later as Fading Victory. That diary stands as the single most reliable Japanese primary source on how the program was actually run at command level, because it is not a memoir written afterward with an audience in mind. It is a contemporaneous record. Between the 6th of April and the 22nd of June, 1945, the Japanese launched 10 mass special attack operations against the fleet off Okinawa, and they were designated Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemum. Kikusui No. 1 opened on the 6th of April with somewhere between 695 and 700 aircraft, of which roughly 355 were designated Kamikaze, about 230 Navy and 125 Army, with the remainder flying as escorts and conventional strike aircraft. The waves that followed ran on the 12th and 13th of April, the 15th and 16th, then the 27th and 28th. May brought the 3rd through 4th, the 10th and 11th, the 23rd through 25th, and the 27th through 29th. June closed it out with the 3rd through 7th, and finally the 21st and 22nd. 10 operations in 77 days. One day into Kikusui No. 1. On the 7th of April, the battleship Yamato went down during Operation Tengo, the surface component of the same offensive. The largest battleship ever built put to sea as part of a suicide operation coordinated with the aircraft. The Naval History and Heritage Command counts approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties during the Okinawa campaign, and Japanese records suggest a little over 1,900. Allied records visually identified fewer than 1,000 as actually reaching a target area. That gap is not an argument that Japanese records were falsified, because aircraft aborted, aircraft got lost, aircraft went down beyond visual range, or ditched, or never found the fleet at all. What the gap does provide is direct documentary evidence that the denominator in every hit rate calculation in this video wobbles by nearly a factor of 2, depending on whose paperwork you count from. Every percentage cited so far rests on top of that instability. The heaviest cost fell at the outer edge of the fleet, paid by the smallest ships in it. 15 to 16 radar picket stations ringed Okinawa, and their function was to sit alone, far from the fleet's massed anti-aircraft umbrella, and detect incoming aircraft early enough for the combat air patrol to intercept. In practice, that meant a destroyer or a destroyer escort, positioned deliberately as the first thing an incoming kamikaze would see. The crews called it the graveyard shift. Ships stayed at general quarters for hours, and in some cases days, and sleep averaged around 4 hours. On the 16th of April, 1945, approximately 22 aircraft attacked the destroyer USS Laffey, which absorbed 6 kamikaze hits plus bomb damage. Laffey did not sink. The destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley was credited with destroying approximately 23 aircraft in roughly 100 minutes. The cost of that duty never appeared only in the casualty columns, because combat fatigue became the dominant category of non-battle casualty in the campaign. Ashore, the 10th Army recorded 26,000 non-battle casualties, primarily combat fatigue cases. 26,000 men removed from the fight at Okinawa without ever being shot. The Americans adapted, and that adaptation explains why the hit rate fell from 27% in the Philippines to roughly 13% at Okinawa. Vice Admiral John S. McCain is associated with the scheme known as the Big Blue Blanket, a massive expansion of standing fighter cover designed to intercept attackers before they were ever in position. The Fighter Direction Network, the picket line, and the flycatcher patrols that hunted Japanese aircraft near their own bases all belonged to the same layered system. And then there was the fuse. The variable time proximity fuse was a miniature radar transmitter placed inside an anti-aircraft shell, small enough and rugged enough to survive being fired out of a gun barrel. Rather than requiring a direct hit or a correctly guessed timer setting, the shell detected the target's proximity and detonated itself. That same operating principle, an emitter and receiver deciding on their own when a closing object has entered a kill radius, is the direct ancestor of the automatic emergency braking radar, now standard in passenger cars. In 1945, it existed to convert a near miss into a kill. A high-echelon American assessment after the Philippines and Lingayen operations estimated that roughly half of all suicide aircraft were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire before reaching a target, and roughly another 1/6 by combat air patrol. Approximately 2 in 3 destroyed before they arrived, which reframes the entire efficiency argument, because the 18.6% never measured the kamikaze. It measured the Kamikaze against one specific defensive system at one specific stage of its development. Change the defense, and the number moves by half, and the Americans changed the defense. Now the commonly held belief and the evidence against it. The consensus position in popular history and in nearly every documentary treatment holds that the Kamikaze was uniquely terrifying because it was uniquely lethal, a guided weapon with a human brain inside it, a hit that could not be aborted. The United States Navy's own wartime damage analysis says otherwise. Across the war, 95 American destroyers took damage from suicide aircraft or from Baka bombs, and of those 95, 13 sank. 13.7%. Destroyers struck by conventional bombs and torpedoes sank at a rate of 28.9%. An American destroyer hit by a kamikaze was roughly half as likely to sink as an American destroyer hit by a conventional bomb or torpedo. The reason is structural, and it is the thing the mythology obscures. A torpedo detonates below the waterline and opens the hull to the sea. A bomb is built to penetrate before it explodes, delivering its charge inside the ship. A kamikaze aircraft, by contrast, arrived as a lightly built airframe striking mostly above the waterline, carrying a bomb load that was frequently modest, at an angle that often produced a skidding impact across the superstructure rather than a penetrating one. Kamikaze hits killed people. Kamikaze hits started fires, wrecked bridges, destroyed gun mounts, and turned crew compartments into casualty lists. What kamikaze hits did far less efficiently was the one thing that actually removes a warship from a war, which is putting water inside it, which explains the fact that almost never gets stated plainly, because across 11 months, thousands of sorties, and several thousand dead pilots, the Special Attack Corps never sank a vessel larger than an escort carrier. No fleet carrier, no battleship, no heavy cruiser. The NAVWEP's tally, counting 24 sunk and 198 damaged within its own defined set, reinforces the point with a detail worth noticing. USS Intrepid took 5 hits. USS Ticonderoga took 2. USS Franklin took 2. Those ships absorbed repeated hits and either kept operating or returned to service. And the USS Franklin belongs in this script for the opposite of the usual reason. The catastrophic damage to Franklin in March of 1945, the footage of that ship burning that turns up in nearly every kamikaze documentary ever made, was inflicted by conventional bombs, not a kamikaze. The most reproduced piece of visual evidence for kamikaze destructiveness is a photograph of something else. The most cited engineering lesson of the campaign concerns the armored flight deck. Royal Navy illustrious class carriers of the British Pacific Fleet carried armor over the flight deck itself, and all 4 British Pacific Fleet carriers were struck at Okinawa. None went out of action for more than about 8 hours. The line that came out of it, "Sweepers man your brooms," has been repeated for 80 years. Air group size paid for that protection. Armor over the hangar meant a smaller hangar, which meant fewer aircraft, which meant less striking power from the same displacement. Engineers make the identical trade today between battery mass and vehicle range, or between shielding and payload on any spacecraft. Protection gets bought with capability, always, and the exchange rate is set by what you expect to be hit by. The armored deck story is more contested than its popularity suggests. The NAVWEP's analysis identifies cases where an unarmored deck structure may have absorbed a glancing impact more forgivingly than armor did, and it identifies the clearest instance of armor proving genuinely decisive as HMS Victorious on the 9th of May, 1945. One clear case. The comparison is also confounded at the root by attack volume, because American Task Force 58, operating 15 fast carriers, destroyed 1,908 Japanese aircraft, while the British Task Force 57, with 4 carriers, destroyed 75. The British carriers were hit less because vastly fewer aircraft were sent at them, and whether the armor or the arithmetic explains their survival is a question the data cannot cleanly settle. Honest accounts leave it open. Japan overclaimed what the kamikaze achieved. The United States underreported it. Both distortions came out of institutions behaving rationally under pressure, and the two almost never get told alongside each other. On the 11th of May, 1945, off Kyushu, two kamikaze aircraft struck the fleet carrier USS Bunker Hill, with Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's flag aboard. Mitcher transferred to the Enterprise, and later to the Randolph. The death toll depends on which source you consult, and the variation is instructive. One naval reference lists 346 killed, 43 missing, and 264 wounded. Another lists 373 killed. A third lists 393 dead, including 41 missing. Same ship, same afternoon, and a spread of nearly 50 deaths produced entirely by whether the missing get counted as dead, when they get counted, and which document a given compiler happened to consult. The United States Navy withheld the Bunker Hill casualties from the American public for more than 6 weeks. Release came on the 27th of June, 1945, and the story ran on the 28th. The Boston Globe headline read, "Now it can be told." The published figures gave 373 dead, 264 wounded, and 19 missing. By the time the American public learned what had happened to the Bunker Hill, the Okinawa campaign was over. The reasoning behind it was not sinister. Disclosing which ships had been hit, how badly, and how quickly they returned to service would have handed operational intelligence directly to an enemy with no other reliable way of confirming its own results. The same suppression that misled the American public also denied Imperial General Headquarters the one thing capable of correcting the Formosa problem, which was an accurate external scoreboard, which produces the strange closed structure at the center of this story. Japan could not verify its results because its attackers never returned. America would not publish its losses because publishing them would have supplied that verification. Japanese planning ran on inflated numbers that American secrecy actively protected from correction, while the American public received a picture of the Pacific War considerably gentler than the one their sailors were living inside. Two nations, two opposite information failures, mutually reinforcing. The aircraft were not the only special attack weapons. They were simply the only ones that worked at all. The Oka was a rocket-propelled piloted bomb, carried to the target area beneath a mother aircraft and then released, and the unit associated with it was the Thunder God's Corps, the 721st Air Group, associated with Captain Motoharu Okamura. American crews called the weapon Baka, meaning fool. On the 12th of April, 1945, an Oka sank the destroyer USS Manard L. Able, which made it the first ship sunk by that weapon. It was also, for practical purposes, the last thing the Oka ever accomplished. One destroyer, set against an entire program of development, production, aircrew training, and the loss of the mother aircraft with their full crews on every failed delivery. The Kaiten was a manned torpedo, and research on it began in February of 1944. On the 20th of November, 1944, Kaiten sank the oiler USS Mississiniua at Ulithi, killing 63. On the 24th of July, 1945, Kaiten sank the USS Underhill. 2 confirmed sinkings is the entire operational record of the manned torpedo program. The Shinyo explosive motorboats and the Fukuryu, divers meant to attack landing craft from beneath with contact charges, contributed less still. This matters for the counting, and it is one of the quiet reasons the ship totals diverge, because some compilations of kamikaze sinkings include vessels destroyed by Kaiten or by other non-aircraft suicide weapons, and others do not. Bill Gordon's examination of the Divine Wind found that of the 32 ships actually named in that book's list, 2 went down to non-aircraft suicide weapons. 34 becomes 32 becomes 30, before anybody has argued about a single landing craft. Return now to the number this video opened with. 34 ships sunk. It sits in encyclopedias, in service publications, and in the head of most people watching this before they pressed play. It originates in The Divine Wind, published in English in 1958 from a Japanese edition first printed in 1951, and the authors were Captain Inaguchi Rikihei and Commander Nakajima Tadashi. Inaguchi served as senior staff officer to Vice Admiral Onishi. Nakajima served as Flight Operations Officer of the 201st Air Group. The most cited statistical source on the effectiveness of the Kamikaze program was written by 2 of the officers who ran the Kamikaze program, 6 years after the war, for an audience that included the country which had defeated them and the families of the men they had sent. None of that makes the book false. What it makes the book is a participant memoir, carrying all the reconstruction, selection, and self-justification that category brings with it. It was never a neutral audit, and it has been used as one for 70 years. The book does not survive its own arithmetic either. Bill Gordon's examination found that the summary states 34 ships sunk, while the list inside the book contains 32 names, of which 2 were sunk by non-aircraft suicide weapons, and the list excludes smaller landing craft along with 6 merchant cargo ships. The most repeated figure in the field cannot be reconciled with the source it comes from. Scientific literature has a well-documented version of this. A claim enters the record on a weak citation, gets cited by a second paper that attributes it to the first, then by a third that attributes it to the second, until the original weak source lies buried under hundreds of layers of apparently independent confirmation. Every subsequent citation looks like corroboration, none of them checked. The technical term is a citation cascade, and it explains how a single unverified number becomes consensus without anybody lying. 34 ships sunk is a citation cascade 80 years deep. So what are the alternatives? Dennis and Peggy Warner, in The Sacred Warriors, published in 1982, list 57. Bill Gordon, working from the Warner list, identifies 10 ships that should not be on it and arrives at 47. Gordon's exclusions demonstrate exactly why this is hard. The Sonoma and the LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, number 1065, both went down on the 24th of October, 1944, before the first organized attack was ever flown. The Hovey and the Palmer were sunk primarily by torpedo and bomb damage. The Dickerson was scuttled after taking damage. The Berry was expended as a decoy after being damaged. 2 further entries turned out to be duplicate listings of the same vessel. The field does not stop there. Lambert, in 1997, gives 56. Nagatsuka, in 1973, gives 49. Yasunabu, in 1972, gives 49. Ozawa, in 1983, gives 47. A 2007 Japanese compilation gives 40. Robin Reilly, in 2010, gives approximately 60. 60 at the top, 30 at the bottom. Once the divine wind gets corrected against itself, that entire spread is generated by 4 questions with no objectively correct answer. Whether a ship damaged by a kamikaze and then scuttled by its own crew counts as sunk by a kamikaze. Whether landing craft, auxiliaries, and merchant vessels count as ships. Whether the attacking aircraft had to belong to a formally designated special attack unit, or whether any deliberate crash counts. And where the program begins and ends. Given that deliberate ramming occurred before October of 1944 and continued to the final day of the war. Every one of those is a definitional choice rather than a factual one, which means the answer to whether it worked depends, before any analysis has even begun, on decisions made by whoever assembled the list. The numbers Japan hid are not only the ones Imperial General Headquarters inflated. They include the ones that were never stable enough to hide. There is a category of taco pilot that appears in almost no accounting of this program, on either side of the Pacific, for reasons that come down entirely to the post-war politics of 3 countries. Korea was a Japanese colony, and Korean men flew special attack missions and died on them. How many is, once again, a question with several correct answers depending on what gets counted. Bill Gordon, working from the Chiran records, identifies 11 Korean Army pilots among the 1,036 who died in the Okinawa campaign. The scholar Rumi Sakamoto refers to at least 17. Bae Yong-ho, in a 2009 study, counts approximately 20 across all theaters, Army and Navy combined. 11, 17, 20. Army only against all services, Okinawa only against the whole war, and it is the same structural problem that produced 34 against 57, reproduced exactly, on human beings this time. The best documented is Lieutenant Tak Kyung-hyun, who flew under the Japanese name Mitsuyama Fumihiro. Born in 1920 in Seishin, in South Gyeongsang Province, Tak graduated from Kyoto Pharmaceutical College, served in the Japanese Army with the 51st Shinbu Unit, and died on the 11th of May, 1945, flying a Ki-43 from Chiran toward Okinawa. Tak Kyung-hyun is enshrined at Yasukuni. A number of widely circulated sources describe Tak as a naval pilot, and that is wrong, because the aircraft was an Army aircraft flown from an Army airfield in an Army unit. Even the birth date shifts across sources, given variously as June, March, and November of 1920. The most documented non-Japanese kamikaze pilot in the entire record cannot be pinned down to a month. There is a story about Tak Kyung-hyun that has been told in books and in 2 Japanese feature films, and it is the reason most Japanese audiences know the name at all. The story runs that on the night before the final sortie, at the Tomiya restaurant near Chiran, Tak revealed his Korean identity to the proprietress Tome Torahama and sang Ararang and wept. The account appears in a 1984 book by Toyota Joe. It does not appear in Takagi Tashiro's earlier account, published in 1957, which covers the same ground. A separate 2001 work by Akabane Reiko, drawing on family testimony, presents it as genuine. 2 Japanese sources in direct conflict, 27 years apart, with the earlier one silent. What the 1957 account does document is a waka poem that Tak Kyung-hyun wrote for his mother. The song may be true. It may also be something added later because it made an unbearable story bearable, and because a Korean man singing a Korean song on the last night of his life hands that story a shape it does not otherwise possess. The historical record permits both readings and settles neither. Tak Kyung-hyun is the real-life model for the Japanese film Hataru, released in 2001, and for a 2007 production about the pilots of Chiran. What happened to these men after death is its own history. South Korea passed anti-collaboration legislation in 2004, and because Japanese special attack pilots were routinely promoted posthumously to officer rank, a Korean Taco pilot risked being classified as a collaborator by the country he had been conscripted from. In February of 2010, a South Korean government committee certified Park Dong-hoon, who flew as Ogawa Masaki, as a colonial-era victim, and the legal reasoning turned on the fact that Park had not been an officer during his lifetime, having died before the posthumous promotion took effect. A man's status as victim or traitor decided 65 years later on the technicality of when a promotion he never knew about became effective. Japan's treatment is no better. The historian Yuki Tanaka found that the guide at the Chiran Museum omitted the Korean pilots entirely until directly asked. In 2008, the city of Seishin planned a memorial to Tak Kyung-hyun, a 4.6-meter stone monument timed to the 63rd anniversary of his death, and protests blocked it. The objection was that Tak had been a kamikaze, which made him an aggressor. Yasukuni cumulatively enshrines roughly 21,000 Koreans, most added after 1952 without family consent, and lawsuits seeking removal continue. A Japanese Supreme Court ruling rejected one such case in January of 2025. Taiwan was also a Japanese colony, and the record there runs thinner still. Taiwan's National Cultural Memory Bank identifies Liu Chi-hung, who flew as Izumikawa Masahiro, as the only officially confirmed Taiwanese special attack fatality. Liu was Hakka, born in 1923 in Miaoli, served in the Japanese Army, and died in December of 1944 in the Philippines, at Leyte. Liu was posthumously promoted and enshrined at Yasukuni. A Taiwanese survivor, Chong Ching-kwong, lived until 2013. Larger recruitment figures circulate in Taiwanese media and cannot be verified, and as one Taiwanese source concedes directly, there is still no reliable data. The Chiran Museum's own accounting carries the evidence of the colonial dimension in plain sight for anyone who reads the base breakdown. Of the 1,036 Army dead it commemorates, 439 flew from Chiran, 135 flew from Taiwan, 128 came from Kingun, 120 from Bansai, 83 from Mayakanojo, and 131 from other fields. 135 men launched from a colony. There is a mirror to this on the American side, and it connects directly to the central theme here. The ability of the United States to assess what Japan was actually planning, as opposed to what Japan was announcing, depended on the Military Intelligence Service, which trained nearly 6,000 linguists, the majority of them Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. They translated captured documents and interrogated prisoners. General MacArthur's intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby, claimed the Nisei linguists shortened the Pacific War by 2 years. The men best positioned to tell the American fleet what the Japanese overclaim actually said were Japanese-American. Black American sailors served aboard kamikaze-struck ships, overwhelmingly confined to the steward's branch as mess attendants and steward's mates, a restriction exemplified by Doris Miller, who died aboard the USS Liscum Bay on the 24th of November, 1943, torpedoed by a submarine rather than struck by a kamikaze. Steward's mates manned anti-aircraft guns during attacks, and their specific roles are poorly documented in ship action reports, which is itself a finding about how the record was kept rather than about what those men did. If the Special Attack Corps ever came close to achieving something strategically decisive, it happened in a battle that never took place. By the end of the war, Japan had accumulated somewhere above 10,000 aircraft in the home islands, held back deliberately from the fighting at Okinawa and reserved for the defense of the islands themselves. Under a plan designated Ketsugo, American intelligence estimates of that reserve escalated month by month, and the escalation is the story. Army estimates climbed from 3,391 in May to 4,862 in June to 5,911 in August. Navy estimates climbed from 8,750 in July to 10,290 in August. The actual figure reached approximately 12,700 aircraft, roughly half of them intended for special attack. Every revision ran upward. Every revision was still too low, and these estimates were being produced in real time for planners deciding whether to invade. The more important change was doctrinal rather than numerical, because Japanese pilots were retrained to attack transports and landing ships rather than warships. That reverses the entire concept. At Okinawa, the kamikaze had been thrown at destroyers and carriers, at the armed edge of the fleet, and it was consumed by anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol before reaching anything. Against an invasion, the target set changes to slow, crowded, thin-skinned vessels packed with infantry. The objective was to destroy 30 to 50% of the invasion force at sea before it ever reached the beach. Apply the numbers already established. A weapon with a hit rate somewhere between 9 and 27% depending on defensive conditions. A weapon which, when it struck a warship, sank it only about 1 time in 7. And a target change from an armored destroyer with radar-directed proximity-fused anti-aircraft batteries to a loaded transport. The lethality equation inverts. The reason the Special Attack Corps could not sink a fleet carrier is the same reason it would have been devastating against troop ships, because it delivered fire and fragmentation rather than hull penetration. And a transport full of men is a target where fire and fragmentation are enough. The Okinawa numbers sat in front of American planners while they were making the invasion decision. 4,907 Navy dead. 133 of 145 ships lost or disabled by air attack, and an intelligence estimate of the aircraft reserve that grew every single month. Admiral Nimitz's position shifted against invasion as the Okinawa losses mounted, and the Joint Chiefs carried misgivings. The historian Richard Frank has argued at length that the projected cost of the Kyushu landings, including mass special attack against troop transports, shaped the decision to use the atomic bomb. Max Hastings, reviewing the work of Emiko Anuki-Tierney, put it more sharply, arguing that the pilots contributed mightily to creating a climate in which 2 atomic bombs seemed a reasonable means of curtailing Japanese resistance. That is the strongest available argument that the kamikaze changed the outcome of the war, and it needs labeling precisely for what it is. It is an argument. The causal chain running from Okinawa's casualty figures, through the invasion estimates, to the decision to use nuclear weapons is reasoned from documented evidence, contested by serious historians, and impossible to prove. What can be stated is narrower and still striking. A weapon that never sank a capital ship and never altered the outcome of a single battle it was used in became a measurable input into the largest strategic decision of the 20th century. 80 years on, the scholarship has not converged. It has hardened into 2 positions that use the same evidence. The first holds that the Special Attack Corps was, under the circumstances Japan actually faced, a rational instrument. Max Hastings makes the case most directly, arguing that for the sacrifice of a few hundred half-trained pilots, vastly more damage was inflicted on the United States Navy than the Japanese surface fleet had accomplished since Pearl Harbor. 20% hit rate, 10 times conventional. 27 ships sunk against conventional bombings won over the same 11 weeks off Okinawa. The supporting logic runs that by late 1944 the alternatives were never suicide attack against effective conventional attack. The alternatives were suicide attack against nothing. Trained aircrew were dead. Carriers were sunk or useless. Conventional strikes were achieving under 1%. In that specific circumstance, a weapon that converted an untrained pilot and an obsolete airframe into a 14% chance of putting an American warship out of the war was the only functioning military option left. Hastings still concedes the qualifier that carries the weight, which is that only overwhelming American material superiority allowed the United States Navy to absorb the punishment. The second position holds that the program was strategically empty and institutionally self-destructive, and the evidence is the evidence already laid out here. No vessel larger than an escort carrier sunk in 11 months. No battle whose outcome shifted. At best around 20% of attacks achieving anything, which means at least 80% of the men who flew accomplished nothing whatsoever. Bill Gordon puts the counterargument in its most deflating form, noting that the war was already lost when the attacks began, so if the percentages had been higher, it really would not have mattered. The program also consumed a specific and irreplaceable population because Japan spent, deliberately and as a matter of policy, its most educated young men, university students, pharmacy graduates, the generation that would have rebuilt the country. A third body of scholarship rejects the framing of the question entirely. Emiko Onuki-Tierney, whose work draws on the pilot's own diaries and letters, argues that many were coerced student conscripts, ambivalent and unwilling, and describes them as tortured souls, browbeaten and abused, not fanatics. Conscripts. M.G. Sheftel, working from oral history with survivors and with the men who designed and administered the program, warns explicitly against equating TACO with modern suicide terrorism, because the organizational logic, the coercion structure, and the recruitment mechanism were categorically different. Ivan Morris situates the whole phenomenon inside a long Japanese cultural tradition of heroic, doomed sincerity, in which the failure itself carries the meaning. At the other end of the interpretive range sits work that reads considerably more sympathetically, including Albert Axel and Hideaki Keisa's treatment, which deserves the same caution as The Divine Wind, for the same reason. Proximity to the subject is not neutrality. Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history, which underpins an enormous amount of what gets repeated about this campaign, is foundational and early and American-centric, and a number of its figures have since been superseded. These positions cannot be reconciled, and the honest thing to say is that they cannot be reconciled because they answer different questions while appearing to answer the same one. Efficient per aircraft expended, futile per outcome achieved. Both are correct. They are simply not the same measurement. The program did not stop when it became obviously pointless. It stopped when the war did, and barely then. On the 29th of July, 1945, the destroyer USS Callahan went down with 47 killed, and Callahan was the last ship sunk by a kamikaze. On the 13th of August, 1945, the attack transport USS La Grange was struck, killing 21 and wounding 89, and La Grange was the last ship hit. On the 15th of August, 1945, the day of the surrender broadcast, Vice Admiral Agaki Matome flew an unauthorized final suicide sortie, carrying his sword and his binoculars. Agaki's staff officer, Captain Miyazaki, asked to accompany him. That account comes through the diary and through associated memoir testimony, which is to say it is documented and also single provenance for the dialogue itself. The same day, 4 American destroyers south of Honshu shot down a lone D-4Y Judy in the final anti-aircraft action of the Second World War. Vice Admiral Onishi Takajiro, who had formed the 1st Special Attack Squadron at Mabalacat on the 20th of October, 1944, killed himself on the 16th of August, 1945. What remains is a museum and an argument. The Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze Pilots opened in 1975 in Minamikyushu, and it commemorates 1,036 Army dead, 335 of whom are classified as young boy pilots. Some were 14. Scholarly analysis of the museum has criticized its blending of a militaristic narrative with an ambiguous pacifist framing, which is a precise description of the problem, because the exhibition mourns the pilots without ever settling what they were doing. In 2014, Minamikyushu submitted 333 letters and documents, drawn from a collection of roughly 14,000 items, for inscription on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. The Chinese government protested, describing the submission as an attempt to beautify a history of militaristic aggression, and South Korea protested as well. A UNESCO advisory panel declined to recommend inclusion. The detail that makes the rejection legible is what happened in the same round, because Japanese documents relating to the Siberian internment of Japanese prisoners were accepted. The panel was not refusing Japanese wartime documents. It was refusing these ones. The objection was not to the archive. The objection was to the frame. So the answer to whether it worked splits four ways. By the measure the Imperial Japanese Navy itself would have recognized, it did not, because the Special Attack Corps sank somewhere between 30 and 60 Allied vessels, none larger than an escort carrier, and it never delayed, deflected, or altered the campaign it was built to stop. By the measure of damage inflicted per aircraft expended, it was the most effective weapon Japan possessed in the last year of the war, and it was not close. By the measure of American lives, it killed 4,907 sailors at Okinawa and produced the worst naval casualties of the Pacific War. And by the measure of what it did to the people who used it, it was a system that removed the only witnesses capable of telling it the truth, and then made decisions on whatever was left. That is the part worth carrying out of this, because the numbers Japan hid were never primarily hidden from the enemy. Imperial General Headquarters announced 11 carriers sunk off Formosa because the reporting system it had built could not produce any other answer, and the combined fleet then sailed into Leyte Gulf on the strength of it, with its own commander privately doubting the figure. Across the water, the United States Navy withheld the Bunker Hill dead for 6 weeks, and in doing so denied Japan the only correction available to it. Both institutions were behaving reasonably. Both produced a picture of the war that was false in the direction their incentives pointed. 80 years later, the most cited figure in the field still comes from a book by 2 of the officers who ran the program, and that book's own list does not add up. The men who flew the missions cannot be asked. The men who counted them had reasons not to count carefully. What is left is a range, an argument, and about 4,000 young men, some of them 14 years old, some of them Korean, most of them conscripted, who were sent to prove a number that nobody has ever been able to establish.